Did I scare you? It's October again. You know what that means. It's time for Halloween. Well, maybe that's not just limited to October because I've seen Halloween junk out for a solid 2 months already. How early is too early? That's a question for a different day. Halloween is a strange holiday to me. Don't get me wrong, I really like Halloween. I think it's dandy, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really make sense why we do it. Celebrating our space rock going around the sun again, that makes sense. Celebrating the birth of the most celebrated religious figure, that makes sense. Celebrating events that pertain to the origin of your country, that makes sense. All of these holidays have a good celebration to cause ratio. There's a clear reason why the holiday is occurring, and it's a justified celebration to accompany it. But when it comes to Halloween, this ratio is messed up. There is a lot of Halloween celebration. Trick-or-treating, Halloween parties, pumpkin patches, haunted houses, extreme house decorating, movies, costumes, specific themes at amusement parks. The list goes on, and while all of these are very fun and really great, what exactly are we doing it for? Well, let's take a big leap back here. Halloween, as we know it, is very different than its origins. Dating back nearly 2,000 years ago, we can find the deepest root in the great cultural tree, or maybe I should say pumpkin, that is Halloween. Like most strange holidays, Halloween can be traced back to paganism, specifically Celtic paganism. Celebrated on the night of October 31st into the morning of November 1st, Samhain was a Gaelic pagan ritual that marked the end of the prosperous harvest season and marked the beginning of the, quote, darker half of the year. It was one of 4 Gaelic seasonal festivals, and it was widely celebrated across Scotland and Ireland. For the most part, very little of Samhain and its rituals was recorded until the beginning of the early modern era, so roughly the 1500s. But from the late documentation of the ritual, we can learn that there were some similarities with Halloween to be found rather than just a date. Aside from this marking the end of the harvest season, the Celts believed that during this transitional period, the lines between the world of the living and the world of the dead was blurred. The openings to sacred burial mounds would be opened and were viewed as portals to the other world. Animal livestock would be brought down from summer pastures and slaughtered for large-scale feasts. There was the lighting of special bonfires that were believed to have protective and cleansing properties. Practitioners believed that spirits of dead family members would come home during this liminal time, so offerings of food would be left out on their behalf, and very notably, people of the village would go mumming and guising, or in other words, they would dress up in costumes going across parts of the village, performing brief folk plays. From the earliest points of Halloween, we can see a few similarities aside from the obvious sharing of the same date. Samhain had a very heavy focus on death and the dead and the supernatural, which are all aspects of horror by modern standards. In a way, our modern Halloween rituals sort of celebrate horror as a genre, and this makes sense seeing that the themes of the celebration just morphed over time away from pagan religious themes to modern themes of horror. But this isn't an end-all explanation, rather we can understand the roots of Halloween when viewing its origins in Samhain. As Christianity rapidly spread throughout Europe, the church was faced with opposition from localized pagan beliefs and rituals. To combat this, Pope Gregory III sought to quote-unquote Christianize many major pagan rituals still present across Europe. While there are many circumstances of this, the one important to our narrative is the Christianization of the Celtic/Gaelic paganism, and particularly Samhain. In order to culturally erase pagan rituals, the church would essentially invent new holidays that were sometimes specific to a given region. In the case of the Celts, many did convert and eventually created their own localized version of Christianity, known as Celtic Christianity, that still has elements of their pagan beliefs. Pope Gregory would deem November 1st All Saints' Day, a day celebrating Catholic saints and martyrs, with the night prior to November 1st, October 31st, being called All Hallows' Eve, which was later shortened to Halloween. But the holiday didn't just stop there. November 2nd was labeled All Souls' Day, a holiday focused on praying for the dead, which was in line with the thematic aspects of Samhain. As this holiday went on, new customs would arise, one of which was the act of souling, in which the poor would go door to door offering prayers for the dead in exchange for a small offering of food, which could be viewed as a precursor to trick-or-treating. The same people would also carry small hollowed-out turnips with candles in them, which could be viewed as the predecessor to the jack-o'-lantern. Now we take a large leap forward in time to the 1840s in modern-day Ireland. The celebration had remained an aspect of Celtic culture for all of these years, but in the current era, the Irish people were experiencing one of the worst events in their modern history, the Great Potato Famine. Many Irish peoples would flee to the newer country of the United States, seeing an opportunity for a better life and to escape oppression. And they would bring many of their culture and traditions with them, including Halloween. Hello there! Today's video sponsor is me, Mystic Ratman. Did you know I sell stickers? They're flying off the shelves. I have limited quantity of them, so go get them. And if I sell enough, I'll consider buying a new microphone, since you all want me to do that so badly. Anyways, back to the video. In the 19th century, certain regions of the U.S. recognized All Hallows Eve as a holiday, but the Puritan majority in New England did not. While there were some regional forms of celebration for All Hallows Eve, they were much different than the traditions of the Irish and the Scots. In the Deep South, Cajun Christians would hold Mass in a cemetery at night on the holiday, with many people staying by the graves of their family throughout the night. With the mass immigration of Scots and Irish to the U.S., particularly into the Puritan Northeast, this would all change. The Irish and the Scots would bring many of their traditions with them, and specific to our narrative, they would continue the tradition of All Hallows Eve, even in their new home of America. But aspects of the tradition had become rather nefarious, which was not good for the early PR of the holiday. In a rather intense contrast from its origins, Halloween had become a night associated with pranks, and they were far from harmless. It's unclear when this tradition started, but it became common practice for roaming bands of children and teens to perform a multitude of different pranks on their neighbors. Initially, it started out with messing with farmers. Kids would venture into their fields, knocking over outhouses, stealing portions of fences, and my personal favorite, putting livestock on barn roofs. Well, these pranks were certainly annoying for the farmers, but they were kind of harmless, right? Property damage was chill, I guess. Unfortunately, the youth of America lost its creativity, and when it came to pranks, reports of physical assaults and violence from roaming groups of teens and kids started to sprout up in cities across America on the holiday, which earned it the name the Devil's Night in cities across the U.S. Community leaders saw the problem that the holiday was causing and knew they had to take action. Knowing that the holiday was not going anywhere anytime soon, they boiled down the root cause and found a solution. Up until the early 1900s, Halloween in America had been a rather unofficial holiday. As previously mentioned, it was only recognized in certain regions across the U.S. and had close to no official celebrations. This gave the holiday a sort of anarchist feeling when it came to these celebrations. Since there weren't any official festivities, people had taken it upon themselves to create their own. And when it came to kids, their version of celebration was just evil pranks. Maybe this had to do with the absolutely terrifying costumes they wear. I don't know, just a thought. Well, in the 1910s, things started to change. More official Halloween festivities started gaining popularity across the U.S., even outside of the Scottish and Irish immigrant communities. A particularly popular event in this era were Halloween masquerade balls, and people started having community festivities in an attempt to curb the appeal of the evil Halloween pranks. Seeing the success and the popularity of costumes, the first major corporate interest in the holiday would appear. Up until the 1930s, most Halloween costumes were homemade. Families would sew these plain old scary looking masks for their children to wear, but you know how kids are. They wanted a different costume every year. Though there had been some cheap paper costumes available throughout the late 1920s, they were very generic. Leave it to no one else other than Disney to be the first person to capitalize on a holiday. Disney started licensing their characters to costume manufacturers in the 1930s and found great success with Children of America. Soon they would contract the company Ben Davis, yes, funny monkey logo Ben Davis, to make a bulk of their early costumes. And for the most part, all of this worked to stop the pranks. But on the Halloween of 1938, Orson Welles did do the ultimate prank, releasing a fake news broadcast of an alien invasion that genuinely fooled a good amount of people. Well, the 1930s and 40s would really be the point when Halloween would start to resemble our own version today. Costume competitions and parties gave way to trick-or-treating. Locals started providing small offerings, often in the form of small, individually wrapped baked goods and coins, as a means to deter rowdy pranking kids. In fact, if you haven't guessed this already, this is where the term trick-or-treat was coined, first being mentioned in a U.S. newspaper around 1937, though the Canadians have been saying it since 1927. Oh, Canada! Well, Halloween, like most things, wasn't too much of a concern in the 1940s as the ongoing Second World War raged. The country was focused on the war effort, and due to sugar rations, the volume of sweet treats that could be made for Halloween was limited, so popcorn became a very popular Halloween treat at the time. Lame! Well, following the war, there would be a great baby boom, with the veterans of war returning with the desire to create the next generation of Americans, and they sure made a lot of them. With the prosperity of the post-war United States and the abundant amount of young children recently born, Halloween shifted its target age group back to even younger children, and oh boy, did they love it. Halloween quickly became one of the most popular holidays for children by the late 40s, and its popularity was noticeable to corporations too. More intellectual properties started to sprout up as costumes, and more companies were manufacturing them. But more notably, candy companies saw what was going on with the homemade sweet treats, and they had the genius idea to start marketing smaller, individually wrapped candies at consumers to be distributed during the holiday. And as you know, it worked. By the 1950s, Halloween was a beloved nationwide holiday. Most people didn't ask where it came from or even knew the roots of it, but they didn't care. It was fun for the whole family, and it was now viewed as a wholesome holiday, whereas just a few decades prior, it was literally called the Devil's Night. What a turnaround, am I right there? The 1960s would only see Halloween spread in popularity, both from a pop culture point of view, but also a merchandising one. The first ever Halloween TV special would be aired in 1966, with the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown, which also solidified Halloween's family-friendly reputation. The episode was a hit, and is still a relevant piece of Halloween media today. I watch it every October because I love Charlie Brown. This would set the trend that pretty much every other long-running show has done since, which is a Halloween special. But this was much more significant than just a TV show being made. This represented Halloween transitioning from a celebrated holiday across the US to an integrated aspect of American pop culture. Another part of Halloween that became more widespread in the 1960s was house decorations. This isn't to say that Halloween decorations didn't exist before. The jack-o'-lantern had been a long-standing tradition, but the 1960s brought Halloween-themed home decor to the masses via retail distribution. So in plain old English, stores started selling Halloween shit, another avenue for companies to make money. Entering the 1970s, the tone of Halloween would have a slight shift. To start, there was the poisoned candy panic of 1974, following after a father poisoned his own children's treats. There would be a handful of other similar cases, but all of them would be extremely publicized enough so that many parents became hesitant to let their kids eat the candy they collected on Halloween at all, even though it really wasn't that widespread of a phenomenon, which was a blow to the modern holiday's reputation. But more importantly, it sort of marked the end of the homemade sweets tradition. A lot of people at this point would still hand out treats like cookies and such, but with the over-publicizing of the poisoned candy panic, individually wrapped, mass-produced, store-bought candies basically became the only thing that was socially acceptable to hand out at that point, which, as you can imagine, was a massive win for candy companies like Hershey's and Mars. Overall, the view of Halloween being a kids and family-only holiday would start to gradually shift. The 70s is when more modern forms of adult Halloween festivities would start to occur. There would be more costumes that were made for adults, and adults across the US started hosting their own Halloween get-togethers while the kids were out trick-or-treating. This can be attributed to the earliest of the boomers who grew up in the 50s and 60s, starting to become young adults themselves, and since Halloween had been such a large portion of their childhoods, they started to hold on to the holiday, now finding other ways to celebrate, but still maintaining the tradition of Halloween costumes, a sentiment that has continued well into the modern era. Celebrations of Halloween started expanding too. Haunted houses were popping up and became a more common activity for Halloween enjoyers to go to during the season. But they were very simple, and nothing like the slog of overpriced haunted houses we have today. But they were usually run by small charities or fun community groups, many of which still do these and are very charming. Shout out to the Portuguese Men's Club in Providence, Rhode Island. Theirs was really silly. But the most important cultural change Halloween experienced during the 70s was a hard association with horror and horror movies. As I mentioned before, Halloween has an inherently spooky feeling and aesthetic associated with it due to its religious roots, but the outright association with full-fledged horror didn't really come until the late 70s for two reasons. To start off, horror movies weren't really horror as we know it until the 70s. In fact, it was still kind of a blossoming genre. Obviously, horror movies go way back to like the 1890s with The House of the Dead or The House of the Devil, and the 1920s with Nosferatu, but as they progressed for years and years, they were honestly just kind of silly. I don't know if this was a byproduct of studios not wanting to actually make scary movies, or maybe people just didn't know how to do horror properly then. But I mean, the Wolfman and Frankenstein, horror icons, yes. Actually scary, no. Well, the big reason for this was that directors didn't really know how to do horror. They didn't use the proper tools to actually make their movies scary, which in summary is jump scares, suspense, music, audio effects to make us on edge, and the use of lighting. Notably, Alfred Hitchcock was the first to make a more modern feeling horror movie with Psycho back in the 60s, but it still lacked the utter shock value that modern horror has. Enter the 70s and this changed. Movies like The Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they really cranked up the scary meter to 10, and all of a sudden there was a newfound respect and seriousness for horror as a genre. So how did it tie into Halloween? I'll let you guess. Halloween, the movie. In 1978, John Carpenter would release his legendary slasher film Halloween in the month of October, starring the creepy slasher serial killer Michael Myers, but more importantly for the sake of our narrative, it would start to seed the widespread association of Halloween with horror films and horror as a genre. A lot of directors and studios for decades to come would follow many of the tropes Carpenter established in the movie, but importantly to the cultural context of Halloween, studios started releasing horror films in the month of October and using Halloween the holiday as a backdrop for many horror films. And this Hollywood association with Halloween sort of represented the next decade as a whole. The 1980s is when Halloween started becoming what many call a corporate holiday. At this point, most people had no idea what they were celebrating, but they did know that it was fun, and for all ages too. But in order to have fun, you have to pay some cash, which made Halloween a multi-million-dollar holiday across multiple industries. Obviously, candy companies were making the most money, and they wanted to keep it that way. They would pour millions into Halloween advertising, sponsoring events, and just trying to associate themselves with trick-or-treating the best they could. In fact, Halloween as a retail holiday was so profitable, so successful, that a certain retailer said, you know what? I'm only going to be open for like 2 months a year, and I'm only going to open myself in abandoned lots, and I'm only going to sell Halloween merch. And they still managed to make millions. Maybe you've heard of them. Yes, in 1983, Spirit Halloween opened its doors with its ever so unique business model. But why is this important, you ask? 1, it's funny. 2, it represents the commercial success Halloween was having on a retail level. People really loved this holiday. The costumes, the decorations, all of it had become much more elaborate, but also much more expensive. At this point, people had gone from simple jack-o'-lanterns to cotton spiderwebs to now plastic pumpkins and early forms of animatronics. But all of this monetary success wasn't just coming from kids, candies, and costumes. The world of adult Halloween also really took off. Bars and nightclubs across U.S. cities joined in the festivities, giving a place for young, childrenless adults to go have fun on the holiday, all while in costume. And of course, the most recent Halloween industry made sure to make money too. Other popular horror slasher films drew masses to the theater with their characters that just so happened to be easy Halloween costumes, with classics like Friday the 13th's Jason and the Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger becoming staple Halloween costumes to this day. So now we enter the 90s, another golden age of Halloween culturally. To start, much of the fear and angst surrounding the holiday from the decades prior began to dissipate, and the holiday returned to having a larger focus on children. The 90s marked the beginning of Halloween-themed movies for kids, no longer just scary horror movies. And some of these movies would be permanently added to the Halloween cultural canon. Notably, Disney led this charge in the return to the child-centered Halloween media with the release of movies like Hocus Pocus and The Nightmare on Elm Street. By the way, genius to morph two holidays into one movie. That equals maximum holiday merchandising revenue. Another side note, Disney had always been one of the largest proponents of Halloween. As mentioned before, they were one of the first companies to create licensed costumes, but at Disney parks for decades they had been doing Halloween-themed events and sort of pioneered the corporate celebratory side of the holiday. Well, if you thought that Halloween was already big, being a multi-million-dollar holiday, try multi-billion-dollar holiday. Around the 90s, big box retailers reported similar revenue levels to Christmas from consumer spending around that time of year. A big reason for this was the time frame in which the holiday was celebrated. Back when people were reasonable and holidays weren't an excuse for companies to make shitloads of money, the celebratory window for most holidays was only a few days. This wasn't a written rule or anything, it was just the way people treated less significant holidays. But the 90s was when the whole seeing Halloween shit for a month began. Some of the largest retailers in America, like Walmart and Target, saw that they were hypothetically losing money to other stores like Spirit Halloween, who were putting their Halloween merchandise out far in advance. So they decided to make the move to do the exact same thing. And it wasn't just limited to big box retailers selling decor, costumes, and candy either. TV channels started to jump on the bandwagon too, which sort of solidified the whole October being spooky Halloween month in our culture. A lot of long-running shows at this point had put out Halloween specials. In fact, so many had put out Halloween specials that it was pretty difficult to show them all during the peak viewing hours of Halloween. So broadcasting companies had the ingenious idea to start spreading them out throughout the entire month, and thus the Halloween Marathon was born. These would be focused on family-friendly channels like ABC and such, but as time went on, they became a staple in kids' television programmings, with the likes of Cartoon Network, Disney Channel, and Nickelodeon really leaning into this broadcasting style to this day. What else? But wait, we're forgetting something. What else are we forgetting? Oh yeah, movies! As previously mentioned, horror movies had become solidified in the Halloween cultural canon, and many of the aforementioned horror classics still drew attention from rewatches during the decade. But overall, the 90s isn't necessarily known for its legendary horror, and the decade is viewed as a stale period for the genre, which forced it to change. Movies like Scream carried the torch of the masked serial killer slasher, but with a meta take on the genre. There would be theatric adaptations of horror classics like Stephen King's It, but the true innovation came in the last year of the decade with the release of The Blair Witch Project in 1999, a found-footage horror that was wildly successful. Why is this important? Well, the Blair Witch Project's advertising was one of the first horror IPs to use a new and blossoming communication medium that would find itself deeply tied into horror, even spawning its own subgenres to this day, that being the internet. The 2000s, the true beginning of the digital age. By the 2000s, Halloween was a $5 billion a year industry. As you may have noticed by now, a lot of the modern traditions and associations with Halloween started out in these organic, fun, cutesy traditions, but were eventually co-opted and bolstered to maximize revenue for specific corporations. Costumes and decor fed big box retailers. Candy fueled the candy industry. Horror movies fueled Hollywood. But there was still one big, fat, untapped oil well of money that had yet to be exploited, and that was haunted houses. As mentioned before, haunted houses were common across the US, but were generally run on a local level. They could be a family farm of a corn maze, or the Portuguese Men's Club of Providence, Rhode Island, buying every Halloween decoration at Home Depot and making you walk through them in their parking lot. They were simple, and people liked them. So, naturally, entertainment giants saw this and went, what if we do haunted houses and we just make them fucking nuts? And that's what they did. Amusement parks jumped on the Halloween hype train and started making their own Halloween celebrations throughout the month of October. Again, this was a trade that was pioneered by Disney, who had been doing Halloween-themed festivities at their parks for decades, but the difference there is that they were more targeted at kids and didn't include the wild stuff their competitors would do. Universal Studios started doing their Halloween Horror Nights that eventually expanded worldwide. Six Flags would have their Fright Night events. Knott's Berry Farms would temporarily rebrand to Knott's Scary Farms in the month of October. Good one, marketing team. And many other smaller chains would do the same. As I alluded to, these were not necessarily kid-friendly, but they were more so an all-ages event targeted at young adults and teenagers. All these events essentially did the same thing. They opened up a handful of miniature haunted houses around the amusement parks that were open at night during the month of October, and they would have scary ghouls walking around the park messing with its patrons as well. Simple in concept, yes, but these have quickly become a staple attraction if you live near one of these amusement parks during the scary month. And let me tell you, I'm actually a big fan of these. I remember going to the Universal Horror Nights in California as a teenager and having my mind blown by the quality of these haunted houses throughout the park. Universal is a special case because they essentially own the IP to every good horror franchise and they can use them in their haunted houses. But what was more impressive to me is that the backlots of the park, they have sets for movies like the Bates Motel from Psycho, some weird-ass Dr. Seuss Whoville shit, and the fucking crashed plane from War of the Worlds. And one of their haunted houses has you just like walk through all of these sets with monsters on it. Mwah! It's incredible. It's so great. Well, finally here, we're entering the modern age and Halloween's current cultural standings. And we can't mention the modern age without, of course, speaking on social media. Social media elevated Halloween's cultural canon to a whole new level. Platforms like Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest, hell, all of them really dialed in on the visual aesthetic of Halloween. People had a platform to spotlight their absolutely insane Halloween costumes. Halloween makeup tutorials became popular, and of course the phrase spooky season was born to describe the month leading up to the holiday. Our new version of cable TV streaming services spiritually upheld the idea of the Halloween marathon from the good old days, adding sections of Halloween content highlighted on your homepage so you can binge watch your favorite gore. And again, there was another shift in the primary demographic of Halloween back over to adults in the 2010s. The 2010s saw more money spent on adult costumes than that of children, and once again, Halloween had become a major event for nightlife venues. Though this isn't specific to Halloween, I'd also like to highlight the rise of internet horror. In this decade, channels like Marble Hornets took the DIY attitude of the Blair Witch Project and crafted a masterful episodic found footage series about the, at the time, popular Slender Man. This format is hard to come by, being done properly at least, but in recent years, Kane Pixel's Backroom series has revitalized the feeling of found footage internet horror that I love oh so dearly. Halloween content has become very popular on social media as well, not just in the makeup costume way, but like scary channels like Nexpo or Chilling Tales have become popular go-to online horror mediums if you feel like getting unsettled. Nowadays, Halloween is a $12 billion a year industry. It's spreading worldwide and for a good reason. It's fun. And at the end of the day, it's weird because it's a corporatized evolution of a pagan holiday which most people don't know about. But if you're still here, you know that now. Well, thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something about Halloween. What did I miss? I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments, dear viewer. If you're still here, consider subscribing to this little rat. Anyways, happy Halloween. Bye-bye.